begin with regarding the 21-day equity challenge. What opened up for you? Don't all speak at once.
Hello, it's Tien again. What opened up for me, I would say, was a consensus. Everyone initially, when they come to this challenge, has an idea of what racism looks like. And I think after participating in this challenge, everyone understands that it looks different for each person. And by combining all of that, I think it empowers all of us to kind of move forward and kind of tackle each situation differently. I think it was day 2, we talked about what is the privilege test, and I took that test and I realized that I had 8% privilege. I'm completely underserved, basically underprivileged. And that was weird for me. Things like, did you go to a summer camp was a privilege? And no, I did not go to a summer camp. But however, there are people who look like me, who have the same experience as me, but were able to go to a summer camp. So, those were just like aha moments for me, and just made me just kind of look at myself and my implicit bias by looking at people who look like me and assuming that they've gone through the same things as me, when that's not true. So that kind of just opened up and just expanded my mind a little bit. And I felt comfortable, like, knowing that about myself.
Yeah. Thanks, Tien. Robin, do you want to share anything? Use your mic.
So one thing that opened up for me was I'm not a big numbers guy, but when I saw real graphs and real maps and colors and stuff, because that works for me. So I saw how things actually showed in Michigan or Washtenaw as the community, how we actually visualize and how things actually are in our community and how we create these barriers in a sense.
I want to echo what Raman said, because I did have the privilege of having a bunch of our students for a luncheon where they just decided to give up their friend's lunch and come and have lunch with the principal to talk about this stuff. It was pretty cool. But what opened up for me was, I've lived in this county now for 38 years. And, I come here as a freshman U of M, also one of those, first gen, had all the weird things going on. But anyways, I didn't know how we were, 8th in racial divide? And I was like,
Income inequality.
Income inequality, it's one of those, I was like, holy crap. It feels like, as you stay here long enough, you don't see it anymore. And so having the fresh eyes of the kids reopened that, and then having the data and the statistics and watching their experience of it, because I remember that experience at 17 when I first got here. And now to still have it happening, it reopened, I suppose. It's not necessarily just opened, but reopened so much of what I had kind of forgotten and become complacent about here and where we live.
Sure. Thank you. Rabbi Josh, I know that you encouraged your congregation to take the challenge, yes?
We did encourage. I wish we had encouraged more, having gone through it myself.
What's still sticking with you from it?
The first week was I think shocking in some ways, as how I perceive myself and the values that I hold and the ways that I act in the world, and some of those tests or assessments, I suppose, that we went through, that I went through. I had taken the, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago when Malcolm Gladwell's book came out, and he mentioned the implicit bias test, and I had done that then. I forget how I came out then, but I certainly did not improve in the last 15 years, I'll tell you that much. And that was, and I kept saying in my head, I'm not good at remembering, the bad or the good, or when they switch, and you keep making sort of excuses. I kept making excuses in my head about why I came out the way that I did, and that's painful to recognize in yourself and to hold. So that opened up for me.
For sure.
And Reverend Evans, I know you also offered the challenge to our congregation. Do you want to talk a little bit about what's sticking with you, what opened up, aha moments?
What opened up for me, moved to Ann Arbor in 2017 after having spent 9 years in Birmingham, Alabama. And the data in and of itself just opened my eyes in a lot of ways, having come from a community for which segregation, oppression, marginalization are very much a part of the community and society. It's very real, very much part of the history of Birmingham and Central Alabama. But when you look at the data, there were times in which I would just look at some statistics from Jefferson County, Alabama, of which Birmingham is the seat, and it really isn't all that different. You just look at the data itself, the raw data. I believe there are certain ways in which we operate out of anecdotes of the South as being a very racist place, or because of their history and the way in which it was codified. I think it's far more explicit historically, but it isn't very different.
Yeah, I was reading an article recently that referred to our area as Up South, right? And of course, this week, I think there's legislation going before the House around finally adopting an anti-lynching law, and thinking about, of the 5,000 recorded lynchings in this country's history, half of them took place in the North. And so, yeah, I think that for many of us, the challenge, and frankly, I want to credit Teresa Gelati and the Office of Economic and Community Development, which 3 years ago brought the Washtenaw Opportunity Index to our consciousness, where we started talking about this tale of two cities, and now unpacking what that actually meant. But I think for many of us, when we were contrasting, Ann Arbor is the world's most educated city, with the fact that in Ypsilanti community schools, 9%, I believe, and you all might know the stats, but 9% of boys of color are reading at third grade level today. Like those are statistics today. It is quite daunting. So how do we take, Reverend Evans, you talk about your experience in the South, and I know that you've been involved in a lot of organizing efforts. How do we take this from discussion, awareness, to action? What are some opportunities that you're thinking about, that you're taking, that you would encourage others to be thinking about, that could materially change that data that we keep staring at and talking about?
One of the things I thoroughly appreciated about the 21-day challenge is that it really encouraged action steps, not just great conversation. And so that which has already been outlined at Bethel, the church where I serve, just constantly engaging our congregants and members of the community, that what we do in church on Sunday morning really ought to impact and influence how we live our lives Monday through Saturday. That our faith ought to drive us, impel us to make changes regardless of the voting, ways in which we engage, our school systems, the ministries that we engage in order to empower people within our community and congregation.
And you and Rabbi Josh actually just recently co-hosted a screening of the film Suppressed, which talks about real-time voter suppression. So thank you for that action step you've already taken. Alize, I'm gonna hop down to you. Many of you know that our county adopted its first ever racial equity policy a year ago, which then made possible the creation of the Equity Office, and Ms. Asberry Payne became our community's first ever racial equity officer. Talk a little bit about your, 6 months on the job? Is it even?
Well, I'm 7 months in.
Okay, what do you see?
It feels like forever. So I think one of the
And I'm so glad you took that job, sis. Thank you. We needed you.
There's a lot to unpack in that statement. In this county, we have a perception of ourselves, even in this room, right? We have a perception of ourselves as being a lot farther along in progress than we actually are. How many people here work for a nonprofit? Show of hands. So 75% of people. The people who are not working for a nonprofit, how many of you work for an institution of some sort? So we're talking about roughly 85, 90% of this room. We get together, we have these conversations with each other. I know a lot of the people in the room, even though I've only been here 7 months. I would bet that most of the people at the tables, you guys know each other, y'all folks know each other. Going from, we have these problems, we have these challenges, we want to do something about it, to actually going into the spaces and connecting with the folks who are being most heavily impacted. These institutional conversations are great, but it's a lot of the same people having institutional conversations, right? We talk about how our county is segregated. It's educationally segregated, it's economically segregated. In terms of literacy, I can draw a straight line from a black third grade boy in Ypsilanti Community Schools to our youth detention center, to our jail, to our state prison system. That's where we're at right now, collectively as a county. So coming across some of those things and the reality of that, how do we go from this space, these conversations, to policy, getting away from program impacts to long-term investment initiatives that are designed to both effectively move the needle, but actually evaluate honestly where we are.
Do you want to share a little bit more about how you're beginning to evaluate? I know I'm hearing your name everywhere. I imagine you are pulled in a million directions, but how are you beginning, even at the county level at least, to evaluate where you are and to use that disaggregated data to guide you towards policy change?
So one of the challenges that we have is that I think the people in this room have a good sense of where we are, but there are about 360 or 70,000 people who live in the county, and we've got 200 people in this room right now. Getting that information out to folks who are not necessarily in our bubble, the people who were not interested in participating in the equity challenge, who didn't even hear about it, getting out into those community spaces and making sure that people have that information. One of the big things I've been working on since I started was preparing a state of equity report for the county, not just internally our county systems, but as a community, where are we actually at? I see Teresa Gelati, who has been invaluable in terms of pulling information for our opportunity index around where do we actually stand? Because a lot of times people have a different perception than where we actually are. So taking that information, getting it out into the community, and really developing a strategic plan that everyone who lives here, who works here, who plays here, who prays here, who is a part of our community can get behind and engage with. Yeah. And making it bigger than just race or just class or just education background or just the just things. What we need to be looking at is an intersectional approach.
Thank you. I want to go back to the individual piece for a moment because I am if you've read Stamped from the Beginning, the author, Ibram Kendi, reminds us that racist policies have been upheld by racist ideas that racist people are married to. And so there, for me personally, were a few moments in the challenge, a few ouch moments, where you realize the ways in which, even as an African American person, I'm upholding white supremacist ideology, I'm upholding racist practices. There were a few of those ouch moments for me, even when we were thinking about having young people in this space today, or frankly when schools were canceled and not having planned for childcare. There are moments where we realize the ways in which we, even if it's unintentional, exclude participation, right? So those were just a couple moments for me and for the organization as we were moving through the challenge and since. What kind of ouch moments did you all have?
I have one, I'll start, even though I went last. We didn't have any of our materials translated outside of, they were available in English and that was it. And so even before the challenge started, there was some feedback from one of our internal county departments that had people who wanted to participate who couldn't. And it was something that as part of the planning and steering committee, we just completely missed. And that was painful in the level of ignorance I think we displayed there.
Yeah, we all were like, oof, we blew that. Yeah, thanks for that. Others? And then audience members, I'm gonna open it up to you, so maybe think about what questions you might have for panelists as well.
I would say it was kind of like an aha and an ouch moment at the same time, because I think it was maybe day 3. One of the options was 28 common racist behaviors or attitudes or something like that, and ways to refute those. And I was talking to my best friend. My best friend is Puerto Rican, however, he tends to be on the fairer side of things as far as color. And unfortunately, well, not necessarily unfortunately, but he identifies himself as a white male because he's just has had an easy process. Like, he's never had to face some of the racism that I have had. So when I was telling him about, one of the ideas is that if I can do it, you can do it. America is the land of the opportunity. You should be able to do it. He feels like no one should have to work twice as hard. But he doesn't understand that I have to work twice as hard as him no matter what. And even though he identifies even though he is Puerto Rican, he looks to everyone else like a white male. So that was like an ouch moment, because we've been best friends for forever, and we had to kind of talk about that and how he's able to do things that I'm not able to do. And even we're best friends, we really got into it, and he was just he was not understanding me, and it's okay. But I mean, it didn't affect our friendship, but I just understand where he is, and he understands where I am.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Michelle?
It's that same combination of ouch and aha. I think it's, I'm living in this community. I worked at Ypsi High for 9 years, now I'm at the early college for another 10, 11. But my kids went to Huron High School, and I taught at Ypsi High School. So this difference and this equity issue has been, an integral part of what I do on a day-to-day basis, as long as I've been a teacher. And it's still, at the early college, we're on the campus of Eastern Michigan University. We don't have a bus. So it's taken us 11 years to hit that 30% of our student body that we set aside seats for kids who qualify for free and reduced lunch. It took us 11 years to hit that 30% number, I think, in our incoming cohort. Even though it's been our intention all along, it's an equity issue. If you can't provide transportation, yes, we're on the city bus line, but that doesn't hit everybody in our county, and not everybody's on a bus line. And that also brought me back to, when I was at Ypsi High and I would drive down Packard to get to work. I think it's really interesting in our bus system, for example, where there's covered bus waiting areas and where there's not, where there are benches and where there are not. If you're headed towards Ypsi, you're not going to see as many covers and as many benches. But if you're in Ann Arbor, over in that Arbor Hills area, they're already covered by trees, but they get a glass cover too. On Washtenaw, I just think there's some really interesting things that I don't know that people look at or pay attention to when you're thinking about how are people just moving about in our county and what is accessible. And our young people, if they're not driving, if their parents can't drive because their parents are working, how are they getting around? It's that bus system. So I kind of paid attention to that a little bit as I was looking at some of these other things. I've gone off on a tangent.
So, like I said before, it made me think of little things and how we have to look back on things. Because when there was an aha moment when I was doing the challenge one day, it was the implicit bias. And then in social studies, I had the opportunity to study the ideas of colorism and microaggression, how even in the same races, we would still have these little boundaries set on how you'd be more privileged to being let's say a light skin to a darker skin. So more people prefer this light skin in a community, which kind of got to me where it would be dang, compared to some other people, I could be less, even though I'm in the same race, which kind of opened the idea of why.
I'd like to hear from you, Rabbi Josh, and you, Reverend Evans, before we open up for questions for you all from the audience. And then if you have any other thoughts, please, jump in, things you want to share that I didn't ask.
So again, I think a lot of this is pertinent to the first week, especially, and thinking about, and I forget the woman's name. She was the professor at Emory. She did a TED talk at Emory about four sort of narratives of racism, and her description of systematic racism as a conveyor belt, and recognizing that I'm on a conveyor belt, that we're all on a conveyor belt together, was just a helpful way of thinking about systematic racism. But then her description of the way that you interrupt that is by turning around and walking the other way. And I'm somebody who just by virtue of my job, I get to talk a lot, and I get to talk at people often. I've said lots of stuff. I think lots of good stuff to my congregation. For me, the things that were raised and the challenge were how often do I put myself in a position to turn around on the conveyor belt? How often do I put myself in a position to turn around and then to get other people to turn around with me? Not to just talk about the way that I want to see the world, but act for a different world, to change the way the conveyor belt is moving. And sort of grappling with that, and decisions that I moved here 4.5 years ago. We knew very, very well the segregated nature of Ann Arbor, of Ypsilanti, of the neighborhoods of Washtenaw County in this general area, and we made decisions about where to live and about where to put our kids in school, and grappling with those decisions, and believing in those decisions to some extent, but also recognizing that they contribute to the conveyor belt that we're on, and holding that is just is ouch for me. I am also very aware that I think one of the most important things we can do is to be in relationship with each other, and so finding opportunities to be in relationship with each other, to hear each other's stories, and encouraging my congregation to do the same. Right? That's part of why I think Pastor Evans and I put on the movie, and will hopefully continue to get our congregations together, so that we can know each other, and that's I hope a healing some to the ouch.
Can we stay there for just a second? I appreciate your willingness to be vulnerable, and what I feel like I heard you say is we came into the community, we understood that there was a racial divide. When we decided where to live and where to educate our children, we still leaned into, I would imagine, a more homogenous community and a school that would give your kids the best education. I think we've all been in a position to do that. What I'd really love to unpack, because we know that our continued segregation, particularly the way schools are funded, when we make those decisions, we are also complicit in drawing resources away from underfunded schools. And I hear you recognizing, yes, we knew this and we were complicit in it. And I wonder, and then you acknowledge it as an ouch. And I think that tension that we're all holding of what do I want? What's the best I can provide for my family, for my, children, for my needs, for my job, for my success, for my future, come in direct contrast with even our aspirations for change. So what do you, as you're processing your own personal ouch, are you at a point where you could invite us to think, I hear you saying where we're, connecting and how we're partnering. Is that your recommendation? Is that how we can get to the change in outcomes that I think everyone in this room wants to see? Is that enough?
No, of course it's not enough just to meet and to interact, but to understand the way that we can build power together, the way to understand the stories, the narratives that each of us have about our lives, about our communities, and about what matters to us, so that we can stand together when issues rise and that we want to be working on together, that we ask each other to work on together. Relationship, I think, allows us to then access each other so that we can make policy shifts in the community. It's the beginning of a process. It's certainly not the end by any means.
Sure, I appreciate that. Comment, Reverend Evans?
My ouch moment began very early on in the process when we were doing the privilege quotient as far as what determines the ways in which you see the world. And if you had asked me prior to like where I would rank on the privilege quotient, I would probably say, I'm a struggling black man. But the truth of the matter is that I do exercise privilege, which gives me access and opens doors in Washtenaw County and Ann Arbor. For instance, with my sons, if there are ever any challenges we have within the school district, my wife and I are on top of it. So if I need to meet with a principal, I'm setting that meeting, I'm putting on a jacket and tie. My wife, who works from home, we'll be there within the next 1 or 2 days, early as possible, meeting we can. Even that in and of itself, that I have a job where I can leave, that I have that sort of autonomy over my time, that I can sit across from a principal and have courageous conversations, which I've been made aware of over the last couple of years. There are a lot of courageous conversations going on. How much action that follow those conversations, I guess, is another question. But even in the ability to show up for my son in a certain way, and then I think of the other black and brown boys and girls, individuals who are poor, whose families can't take off of work. And so where there are questions in regards to an email that came out several weeks ago, if your child's not feeling well, keep them at home. Well, I can do that. But if I'm working an hourly job, where if I don't work, I don't get paid, that's a very different conversation for a parent. How then do I use the privilege that I'm afforded to really be an advocate and a disruptor in some ways, walking the other direction on the conveyor belt? And so that happened very early on. Was that the first or second day, or?
Second, I believe.
And so that was my aha and ouch moment all at the same time.
Thank you. Mashad, did I see you want to say
I just, since so much has come around education, I just want to throw out this idea because for many of us, this has been ongoing, very long work. But if we, as a county, if we go back into our communities and we really want to hit that lever at a place where change can happen, obviously we've got these young people in the room, and moving forward, hopefully when they take over, it'll happen even more so. But I want to propose that people seriously think about what would it look like if we had a single county school system in Washtenaw County. If we are going to be this progressive, forward-moving, really make a difference community, if we're going to put our money where our mouths are, why don't we have a single county-wide public education system in Washtenaw County so the equity is equitably moved about the county, or much more so. I know it's not going to be perfect, but I think I'd like to just kind of throw that out there because I have this privilege of working with a school pseudo-district that is county-wide. And I think that having been a part of the public school system in this county since I've been in education, I think that would be a big lever place to move things.
Yeah, I remember. We have 9 school districts in this county. If they unified tomorrow, on day one, we would save $65 million just in our overhead costs. So there's something legitimate to think about. We also have an Ann Arbor Public Schools Foundation that has, at last I knew, $1 million, and the Ipsy Schools Foundation that has less than 5 figures in its coffers. So, but I want to acknowledge, I learned this week that our neighbors in Manchester, another community in our county, lost their only pharmacy. They also, if I recall correctly, lost their last grocery store. They have to drive 15 minutes to get a tomato from Chelsea or neighboring communities. Poverty has become brown in our eyes, and when we think about it, we tend to think exclusively of Ypsilanti and of black and brown people. And while there are disparate and compounding inequities for folks of color on the east side of the county, more and more those in rural communities are impacted as well. So I just want to bring that into this space as well. Food access, access to education, these are human rights. And frankly, elders in our community are being denied those human rights, along with our young people, and it really is a testament to, regardless of how woke we want to think we are, the fact that any child is not learning or any elder is without transportation is a transgression on our watch. We are each an owner and an actor in that. I want to go back real quick before I open it up to the audience. You know, Rabbi, I've been thinking a lot. The work that we do at New is a lot about working with individuals. And as we, throw around this systems change and structural change work, it's so important to understand what we mean when we say that. And so I want to lift up that the New Center is up on Main Street. It buttresses what had been a historically Black community. Many of you who have lived here for a long time know that. And Community High School, which is a magnet school in our community, one of the top performing in our state, was at one time Jones Elementary School. In many of our lifetimes, it was Jones Elementary School, and it was a predominantly African-American elementary school. How many of you all knew that? Okay, so about half of the room. A shout out to Jessica Leetall with Building Matters and Matthew Countryman, who's the Dean of Africana Studies at the University of Michigan, as well as the African American Cultural History Museum, who facilitated a journey of racial history in this county. And we stood on the Jones site, where now it is majority white, community high, and majority affluent kids. And it is very difficult now because of the lottery system to have any kind of purposeful way of ensuring that Black and brown children can participate in the school. That happened on our watch. We have blocks that are, what would that be, west of Maine, that were predominantly African American owned and homes and home ownership, that now a resident just told me there's one African American family on their block that had been predominantly Black. So when we are making choices about where we live, where we play, where we work, we've got to be mindful of the history, because that helps you to understand and to enter that community with honor and reverence. And we've got to ask ourselves those questions about, and myself included, I'm not pointing any fingers, where we're sending our children to school, how we're ensuring, when Reverend Evans talks about families that are suffering, when we school of choice, the children that get left are the families that don't have that option to school of choice. So not only is it that we're moving our kids, but then the districts that are left with children who are most vulnerable now have compounding issues, right, that they're supporting those families. So I just want to shout out Alina Zachary-Ross, the superintendent of Ypsi Community Schools, who's a fierce advocate, came out of Muskegon first, and we really need to wrap around her and around the children there to ensure that every baby in this community, not just those with privilege, have a chance to thrive. I don't want to take up too much more space. I want to open up. What questions? We're going to go into some small group dialogue at our tables, but I want to get your voices or questions of our panelists, our esteemed participants.